There is a version of history that everyone learns. You heard it in school, probably. Silk caravans crossing vast golden deserts. Camels loaded with bolts of gleaming fabric, moving slowly between China and Rome. A road connecting two ends of the known world. A road that changed everything. The name was clean and memorable, and it attached itself so firmly to the popular imagination that by the time most people reach adulthood, it feels like something they have always known. The way they know that the Earth orbits the Sun, or that fire requires oxygen. The Silk Road, an established fact, a settled matter, except it was not settled by the ancient traders who walked it. It was settled by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen, who coined the phrase in 1877, sitting in an office in Berlin, nearly 2,000 years after the routes he was describing had first been used. Von Richthofen had studied maps and trade records. He had assembled a reasonable picture of how goods moved between East and West in the period following 130 BCE, and he gave the whole thing a name that was clean, poetic, and slightly misleading: Silk Road. Two words that flattened a world of complexity into a single, photogenic image. The problem with the image is not that it is wrong. Silk was traded, the roads were real, China was at one end, and the Mediterranean at the other. The problem is everything the image leaves out. It leaves out the routes that preceded it. It leaves out the goods that were more important than silk. It leaves out the civilizations who maintained the trade long before any Chinese emperor thought to formalize it. And perhaps most significantly, it leaves out the question that nobody seems to have asked with any urgency. If the Silk Road was only named in the 19th century, what was it called before that? And if it had no name, does that mean it had no predecessor? Consider the geography for a moment. The mountain passes through the Hindu Kush, the river valleys of the Iranian plateau, the caves and channels beneath the Central Asian desert. These did not form in 130 BCE. They had been there for millennia. They had always been passable by determined people carrying light loads. And determined people, as history repeatedly demonstrates, are never content to sit still when something valuable exists on the other side of a mountain. Historians have spent generations studying what moved along the Silk Road, the commodities, the currencies, the cultural exchanges. They have been meticulous and thorough and, in many cases, brilliant. But there is a quieter question that runs beneath all of that scholarship like a second river moving underground. Not what was on the road, but what was under it. Not where the caravans went, but where the people before the caravans went, and why, and how they built something so resilient that it was still functioning when the Han Dynasty finally arrived to give it an official name. That quieter question is what this story is about, and the answer, it turns out, is older and stranger than almost anyone expected. Here is a fact that should give pause. In the year 2600 BCE, roughly 4,500 years ago, a queen named Puabi was buried in the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, in what is now southern Iraq. Her tomb was elaborate and extraordinary, stocked with the kind of wealth that signaled she had commanded enormous power in life. Among the objects sealed inside with her were headdresses decorated with deep blue stone, necklaces threaded with the same vivid color, inlaid panels and game boards embedded with that unmistakable shade of blue that seems to contain something of the night sky. That stone was lapis lazuli, and lapis lazuli, in the entire ancient world, came from exactly one place, a mountain valley called Sar-e-Sang, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. Between Sar-e-Sang and Ur lies nearly 3,000 kilometers of terrain, desert, plateau, mountain range, river system. In 2600 BCE, there was no Silk Road. There was no acknowledged trade network. There was no diplomatic relationship between the civilizations of Mesopotamia and the highland cultures of Central Asia that survives in any written record. And yet the stone was there, buried in a queen's tomb, cut and polished and set into gold. Somebody moved it. The journey did not happen once. It happened hundreds of times, because lapis lazuli appears not in one Sumerian burial, but in dozens, across centuries, arriving in quantities too consistent to be explained by accident or adventure. The mines at Sar-e-Sang were being worked. The material was being processed. and it was reaching Mesopotamia on a schedule regular enough to supply entire royal dynasties with a luxury they had apparently decided was essential to their authority. That kind of regularity does not come from chance. It comes from infrastructure, from relationships, from knowledge of routes, from communities who had agreed over many generations on how goods would move and who would move them and what they would receive in exchange. The Silk Road was still 15 centuries in the future, but something was already functioning. Something was already moving. Lapis was not the only proof. Carnelian beads from the Indus Valley, carved in the distinctive style of the Harappan civilization, have been recovered from graves in Mesopotamia dating to 2500 BCE. Cotton, a plant cultivated in South Asia, appears in Persian Gulf settlements centuries before any formal overland trade connection has been acknowledged. Copper from Oman, tin from the mountains of Afghanistan, shell ornaments from the Indian Ocean coast, all of them appearing repeatedly and reliably, thousands of kilometers from where they were made, in a period when history insists the world was still too disconnected for such movement to have been systematic. What is striking is not simply the distance, it is the pattern. When archaeologists map the distribution of these finds, the objects do not scatter randomly. They cluster along specific corridors, particular valleys, particular highland approaches, particular sections of coastline with a fidelity that suggests not random wandering but intimate knowledge of terrain. The people moving these goods were not explorers stumbling across new country. They were merchants retracing paths they already knew, passing through waypoints they had been using for generations. The routes they chose did not follow the open plains where armies moved and kings could watch. They followed the hidden margins of the landscape, the secondary valleys, the cave-riddled foothills, the underground water channels that threaded through the desert like invisible veins. Someone had built something, and they had built it in the dark, where no one would think to look. There is a principle that experienced historians understand, but rarely state plainly. What gets recorded in any era is almost never the whole picture. It is the version of events that the people with power wanted, preserved the victories of kings, the edicts of priests, the founding myths of empires. What gets left out is equally deliberate. Trade routes that no king controlled and no priest sanctioned do not appear in royal inscriptions. Merchants who operated beneath official awareness left no monuments. Knowledge that moved quietly between communities generated no commemorative tablets. This is not coincidence. It is the nature of systems that survive precisely by remaining unrecorded. A trade network that could be found could be taxed. A trade network that could be taxed could be controlled. A trade network that could be controlled could be strangled. The people who maintained these ancient routes understood this not in abstract terms but as a practical matter of survival. They stayed out of the light. They moved at the margins. And in doing so, they made themselves nearly invisible to the very historians who would one day go looking for them. The word subterranean carries two meanings, and both of them apply here. In a literal sense, portions of this older network moved underground through the qanat water channels that tunneled beneath the Iranian plateau for hundreds of kilometers, through cave systems in the Zagros Mountains known only to the communities who had sheltered in them for generations, through underground storage complexes built by Bronze Age civilizations that official history has never fully named. The infrastructure was, in places, physically beneath the surface of the earth. But subterranean also means something operating beneath the layer of events that history chose to record. This earlier trade network was not invisible because it was small or insignificant. It was invisible because it was deliberately and skillfully maintained that way, because the people who depended on it knew that the moment it attracted official attention, the calculation would change. Once an empire knew a route existed, the route belonged to the empire, and the people who had built it over centuries would find themselves working for someone else. The contrast with the official Silk Road is sharp and instructive. The Silk Road that history celebrates was a spectacle: ambassadors in silk, diplomatic gifts, royal patronage, named envoys whose journeys were recorded by court scribes on both ends of the transaction. It was designed to be seen. The network that preceded it had no interest in being seen. It had no ambassadors, no silk-clad envoys, no diplomatic records. It had mountain passes that no garrison was posted to watch, water channels that looked like irrigation infrastructure and carried other things besides water, and relay communities who passed goods from hand to hand across distances that no single group would ever travel alone. Over the chapters that follow, this story will trace that invisible network piece by piece, from its first tentative expression in the movement of volcanic glass across prehistoric landscapes, to the great Bronze Age civilizations that gave it structure, to the empires that tried to suppress it, and the people alive today who carry its fingerprints in their genes. The road that history forgot is still there. It has been waiting a very long time to be found. Long before the first city rose from the mud of Mesopotamia, long before the first crop was planted in the river valleys of the Fertile Crescent, human beings were already trading. Not casually, not incidentally, but with deliberate regularity across distances that should, by every conventional understanding of prehistoric life, have been impossible to maintain. The evidence is scattered across thousands of archaeological sites, largely overlooked in popular history, and it points to something that changes the timeline of commerce entirely. Trade, it turns out, did not begin with civilization. Civilization may have begun with trade. The material that makes this argument visible is obsidian volcanic glass, formed deep in the earth wherever ancient lava flows met the right conditions, and prized in the prehistoric world for one reason above all others. It was the sharpest material a human being could obtain. When obsidian is fractured correctly, it produces an edge so fine that modern surgeons have experimented with obsidian scalpels for the most delicate procedures. In a world before metal, a blade of obsidian was the most precise cutting tool that existed. For hunting, for surgery, for the processing of food and hide and bone, it was irreplaceable. The nearest obsidian sources to the communities of ancient Anatolia, the Levant, and the Zagros foothills were volcanic formations scattered across specific highland zones, the Goluda and Nenezidar formations. Near what is now Cappadocia, several formations in the Lake Van region of eastern Anatolia, others further east and south. These were not sources anyone stumbled upon accidentally. They were specific, known, documented in the geological memory of communities who had been using them for thousands of years. And here is what the archaeology shows. Obsidian from Cappadocia appears at Natufian sites in the Levant, over 1,000 kilometers distant, in deposits dating to 12,000 BCE or earlier. The same Cappadocian material turns up at sites across the Zagros foothills. The Van region obsidian follows a different distribution pattern, appearing in communities to the south and east, as if the two sources each had their own territory, their own established client communities, their own lines of movement through the landscape. Communities were not taking obsidian from wherever happened to be closest. They were returning, generation after generation, to the same sources, which means they were maintaining relationships with the people who controlled access to those sources. That maintenance of relationship across generations and distances is, in every meaningful sense, trade. Not yet commerce in the modern sense. There are no prices, no contracts, no currencies. But there is exchange, regularity, and mutual obligation. There is a social infrastructure that keeps goods moving even across the kind of vast distances that a single person would rarely travel in an entire lifetime. What the obsidian distribution maps show, when overlaid on the physical geography of the ancient Near East and Central Asia, is something unmistakably familiar. The corridors of movement follow the hidden margins of the landscape. They trace secondary valleys and highland ridgelines rather than the broad river plains. They connect highland sources to lowland communities along routes that offer water, shelter, and concealment. These are, in their earliest form, the same corridors that would carry Lapis and tin and Carnelian 4,000 years later. The skeleton of the subterranean silk network was already laid down in the movements of people carrying volcanic glass. Trade does not begin with luxury, it begins with necessity. And it follows geography with the fidelity of water finding its level. The Sari Sang Valley sits high in the Badakhshan province of northeastern Afghanistan, at an elevation that makes the air thin and the winters brutal. The mountains there are the color of pale bone for most of the year, except for the outcroppings where the rock opens to reveal veins of something extraordinary, a deep, saturated blue that seems almost impossible in that landscape of grey and white, as if the sky itself had been pressed into the earth. This is where lapis lazuli forms. This is the only place in the ancient world where it formed in quantities significant enough to supply civilizations with the material for their most sacred objects. And the fact that lapis lazuli from this particular valley appears in the burial chambers of Mesopotamian royalty in quantities sufficient to upholster entire headdresses. More than 2,500 years before the Common Era is one of the most quietly devastating facts in all of archaeology. Because it means someone was moving it, not occasionally, not experimentally, regularly, reliably, in volumes that supplied a demand sustained across centuries. The Lapis trade was not an adventure. It was a system. Tracing the route that Lapis traveled from Sa-i-Sang to Ur requires following the physical geography of the region rather than any written record, because no written record of this trade exists from its earliest periods. The mountains of Badakhshan give way to the river valleys of ancient Bactria, where the Oxus flows westward and southward, carrying the logic of the route with it. From Bactria, the corridor turns toward the Iranian plateau, either across the Kupet Dag foothills in the north or through the mountain ranges of the Helmand Basin in the south. Either way, the material eventually reaches the great highland zone of what was ancient Elam, the civilization occupying what is now southwestern Iran and the Zagros mountain range. From Elam, it descends through the foothills into the floodplains of Mesopotamia, where the rivers meet the sea and where, in the 3rd millennium BCE, the most powerful urban civilizations on Earth were consuming lapis as if it were air. This journey was not made by a single person or a single group. The distances involved 3,000 kilometers from source to final destination were not traveled whole. Each stretch of the route was owned by different communities, each of whom passed the material forward in exchange for whatever the network was sending back in the other direction. Metal, grain, textiles, knowledge. The lapis arrived in Mesopotamia, having passed through 4, 5, perhaps 6 sets of hands, each of which added to its value and guaranteed its authenticity in ways that the receiving community understood and trusted. Along the way, it was processed. The site known as Shari Sokhta, the burnt city in the Helmand Basin of what is now southeastern Iran, was not merely a stopping point on the lapis route. It was a manufacturing hub, one of the largest settlements in the ancient world during the 3rd millennium BCE, where raw stone arrived from the mountains, and finished beads, pendants, and inlays left for the west. The evidence from Shari Sokhta includes workshop floors thick with lapis chips, specialized tools for bead drilling, and storage areas suggesting material was held in quantity before being redistributed. This was not a village incidentally involved in trade. This was a city whose economy was built around processing a single material and moving it to customers 1,000 kilometers away. The civilization of Elam, sitting between the workshop cities of the east and the consuming courts of Mesopotamia, occupied perhaps the most powerful position of all, the gatekeeper. Elamite administrative tablets from Susa record the receipt of materials arriving from the east in quantities that cannot be explained by local production and their redistribution westward in forms that earned Elam an enormous political and economic advantage over its Mesopotamian neighbors. Elam did not produce lapis. Elam managed its flow. And in managing its flow, Elam built an empire on a foundation that no official history of the ancient Near East has ever properly credited. The lapis route was not a curiosity. It was civilization's first supply chain, and it ran through darkness. The most counterintuitive fact about the subterranean silk network is that it had no center. There was no headquarters, no controlling authority, no single power that decided where goods would go and who would carry them. For a modern mind accustomed to thinking of infrastructure as something built by governments and maintained by institutions, this is almost impossible to hold in the imagination. How does something so large, so consistent, and so durable function without anyone in charge? The answer lies in an organizational model that anthropologists have documented in dozens of pre-contact trading systems across the world. From the cooler ring of the Pacific Islands to the long-distance exchange networks of pre-Columbian North America, the model is the relay. Goods do not travel their full distance with a single carrier. Instead, they move from community to community, each group carrying them only as far as the edge of their known territory. The distance within which they maintained relationships, understood the terrain, and could guarantee the safety of what they were moving. At that edge, they handed the goods off to the next community, which carried them the next leg, and so on, until the material reached its final destination through a chain of handoffs that no single participant ever saw in its entirety. This model feels primitive to modern sensibilities, but it is not. It is in fact more resilient than any point-to-point system a single authority could design. When one community in the relay chain is disrupted by drought, by conflict, by political collapse, the goods do not stop moving. They find a different path, routed through another community that occupies adjacent territory and maintains relationships with both sides of the gap. The network absorbs disruption the way water absorbs an obstacle. It goes around. There is no node whose destruction breaks the system, because the system has no nodes, only relationships. This explains something that has puzzled archaeologists for generations: the survival of long-distance exchange patterns through catastrophes that should have destroyed them. The Bronze Age collapse of approximately 1200 BCE, a period so catastrophic that it brought down palatial civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean in less than a century, did interrupt trade along many formal BCE routes. But it did not interrupt the subterranean silk network. Goods were still moving through its corridors during and after the collapse, following paths that no palace administration had ever controlled, and that no collapse of palace administrations could therefore shut down. The informal network outlasted the formal ones by centuries, as it always had. A relay system of this kind generates no central archive. No single community kept a complete record of what was moving through the system, because no single community ever saw more than its own segment of the whole. The Lapis merchant in Badakhshan knew the destination was west, somewhere far beyond the edge of his world. The Elamite gatekeeper knew the material came from somewhere east, carried by people he dealt with regularly, but whose origins he might never have directly visited. The Mesopotamian goldsmith who set the stone into a queen's headdress knew only that it arrived, reliably, from a trader who had always provided good material at a fair price. Nobody wrote down how it worked, because nobody knew how it worked in its entirety. It was not a secret. It was simply bigger than any single perspective could contain. And this invisibility, structural rather than intentional, is precisely why it survived so long, and why history, which depends on records and the written testimony of people who understood what they were witnessing, has had such difficulty accounting for it. The network existed in the gaps between what anyone chose to record. It lived in the space between what one community knew and what the next one knew. And in that space, quietly and persistently, it moved the world. Before a single tunnel was dug, or a single pass was named, the earth spoke in a language that ancient traders learned to read with extraordinary precision. The landscape of Central and West Asia is not uniform. It is folded, fractured, and layered by geological forces that created, over millions of years, a kind of natural infrastructure that observant and experienced communities could exploit with a sophistication that no authority ever formally mapped or recorded. To understand the subterranean silk network, one must first understand the terrain it moved through, because the terrain was not merely the setting. The terrain was the architecture. The most obvious routes through any landscape are almost never the ones that careful people use. Major river valleys offer flat ground and reliable water, but they also offer visibility, the kind of open geography that makes you easy to see and easy to follow. For armies, this is acceptable. For merchants carrying goods that attract attention, it is dangerous. The communities who maintained the pre-Silk Road network consistently avoided the major arteries and chose instead the secondary drainage systems. The narrow tributary valleys that run parallel to the main rivers, but sit slightly higher and out of easy view. The ridgeline paths that follow the crests of hills, rather than the floors of canyons. When modern archaeologists overlay distribution maps of pre-Silk Road trade goods onto satellite terrain maps of the region, the pattern that emerges is striking. The concentration of finds follows the hidden geography with a fidelity that approaches precision. Objects appear not in the open lowlands, but in the places where the land folds back on itself. The narrow gorges of the Zagros Fold Belt, the sheltered Piedmont valleys at the foot of the Kopet Dagh Range, where the mountains meet the desert at an angle that creates zones of shade and moisture invisible from any distance. The karst terrain south of the Caspian, where limestone has been dissolved over millennia into a network of natural shelters and underground connections. The traders also knew water. In a landscape as arid as much of Central Asia and the Iranian plateau, water is not simply a resource, it is the primary constraint on movement. A route that cannot supply water at regular intervals is not a route that can sustain commerce. The ancient traders knew every spring, every seasonal stream, every subsurface seepage point along their corridors, and they organized their movement around this knowledge with the care of people whose survival depended on it. This knowledge was not written down. It was carried in the memory of communities who passed it from generation to generation through the practical experience of making the journey the way a child learns. Which rocks in a stream are slippery by watching where a parent places their feet. The oral traditions of highland communities throughout the Zagros, the Hindu Kush, and the Elburz ranges preserve fragments of this geographic knowledge in the form of route narratives, sacred stories set at specific landscape features, and the names of places that carry no meaning in the current language, but correspond precisely to locations where the archaeology later finds evidence of ancient use. The earth kept the memory that the people could not always afford to write down. And when the archaeology is read against the terrain with care, it becomes possible to see something that was never meant to be visible. The invisible web of paths that moved the ancient world's most precious goods through its most hidden corridors, leaving almost no trace except the objects themselves scattered across the landscape like breadcrumbs dropped in the dark. There is an engineering achievement that sits beneath the Iranian plateau in quiet, almost complete obscurity, invisible from the surface, except for the rows of small circular openings that march across the desert in dotted lines, evenly spaced, stretching from the mountains to the plains in sequences that can extend for 50 kilometers or more. These openings are the shafts of the qanats, the ancient underground water channels that are one of humanity's most extraordinary feats of civil engineering and one of the least discussed. More than 37,000 of them are believed to still exist in Iran alone, some of them functional after 3,000 years, continuing to deliver mountain water to desert communities through tunnels dug by hand through solid rock and earth without any instrument more sophisticated than a plumb line, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of master well diggers. A qanat works by tapping an aquifer at the foot of a mountain range and allowing the water to flow downhill through a gently graded tunnel until it emerges at the surface in the flat desert miles away. The tunnel is accessed from above through a series of vertical shafts spaced roughly 30 to 50 meters apart, which allow workers to remove excavated material and provide ventilation during construction and maintenance. When the system is operating, these shafts serve no particular function for the water itself. They are access points, maintenance ports, openings into the underground. The oldest confirmed qanats date to the 1st millennium BCE, and several scholars have argued persuasively for origins as early as 3000 BCE in the Kerman and Yazd regions of the Iranian plateau. The technology spread across an enormous range, to the Arabian Peninsula, to North Africa, to the Iberian Peninsula, to China's Xinjiang province. Wherever communities needed to move water through arid terrain, the qanat solution appeared, adapted to local geology and maintained by local specialists whose knowledge was fiercely protected and transmitted only within specific lineages. What this story is interested in is not primarily what the qanats carried for their communities in terms of water, essential as that was. It is what else they carried. Because the underground sections of major qanat systems, tunnels 1 to 2 meters wide, several meters high in the larger examples, extending for tens of kilometers beneath the surface of the desert, were known intimately by the communities who built and maintained them. The shaft openings were waypoints, the tunnels were corridors, and in a landscape where visibility meant vulnerability, underground corridors of that length and reliability were not merely useful for irrigation, they were useful for movement. The evidence is scattered but consistent. Archaeological surveys in the Kerman, Yazd, and southern Khorasan regions of Iran have documented the discovery of pre-Silk Road trade goods, bronze implements, lapis fragments, Carnelian beads in contexts that place them at or near qanat infrastructure with a frequency that exceeds what chance would predict. Storage caches associated with ancient qanat shaft systems include objects that have no local origin and no obvious explanation for their presence in a remote maintenance point deep in the desert, unless someone was using the underground system for transport as well as water management. The qanat shaft, entering the earth from above and descending to meet the horizontal tunnel below, creates exactly the kind of covered, concealed, water-supplied underground corridor that a merchant carrying valuable goods through monitored territory would consider ideal. You enter from the surface at a point that looks like any other feature of the agricultural landscape. You move below ground through a tunnel that delivers you kilometers away from your point of entry. You emerge at another shaft opening that looks identical to the first. No one on the surface knows you used the system. This is not speculation about intent. It is observation about capability. The qanat network created an infrastructure of underground movement across the Iranian plateau that existed and was maintained long before any Silk Road camel train assembled in a courtyard in Chang'an. When the subterranean silk is called a literal underground network, the qanats are part of what makes that description accurate. The road was real. It ran beneath the desert. And the desert, from above, showed almost no sign that anything was passing through it at all. Every mountain pass that history has bothered to name was named because armies used it. The Khyber Pass is famous because conquerors crossed it. Alexander among them, and before him the Achaemenids, and after him everyone from the Kushans to the British. The passes that armies chose were the wide ones, the ones that could accommodate horses and supply wagons, and the logistical sprawl of a military force on the move. They were chosen for their capacity, their width, their accessibility to organized, well-provisioned movement. The passes that the ancient traders chose were different. They were narrow, difficult in places, approached through terrain that discouraged the casual traveler and was simply unknown to anyone who had not been taught the approach. They were chosen not for capacity, but for invisibility, for the fact that no garrison would ever be posted to watch them, that no army would ever bother to cross them, and that no record keeper in any palace would think to ask about them. These were not famous passes. They were not even named in most historical sources. They existed in the knowledge of mountain communities, the way certain fishing spots exist in the knowledge of old fishermen, inherited, specific, and absolutely not for sharing with strangers. The Acrobat Pass in the northern Hindu Kush is one example. It connects the Badakhshan region of northeastern Afghanistan, the Lapis source, directly to the upper Indus Valley, without routing through any of the major settlements that controlled the better-known crossings. It is high, cold, and demanding. It requires knowledge of the approach on both sides that can only come from experience or from instruction by someone who has made the crossing before. And when the distribution of Lapis lazuli artifacts is mapped in relation to the Indus Valley sites that receive them, the concentrations cluster in a pattern that makes most sense if the acrobat approach was the primary route, not the more traveled crossings that later armies would use. The Hezar Masjid range crossings in northeastern Iran tell a similar story. The Hezar Masjid separates the Kopet Dagh Piedmont from the Turkmen steppe to the north. The formal routes through this range are few and well known, but the informal crossings, accessed through the smaller valleys that cut through the range at angles the main routes ignore, are many. And the distribution of Oxus civilization material on both sides of the range suggests that these informal crossings were in regular use during the Bronze Age, feeding goods between the network's northern trading partners and its southern networks, without ever passing through the administrative centers that would have imposed fees and kept records. The Pamiri communities of the Wakhan corridor preserved their route knowledge longest because the corridor was remote enough that no empire found it worth fully incorporating until the modern period. When 19th century European explorers began moving through the Wakhan, part of the great game of intelligence and influence being played between Britain and Russia across Central Asia, they recorded oral traditions from local communities that described the landscape in terms of almost ceremonial precision. Specific rocks, specific valley junctions, specific water sources, each one associated with a name and a story that the community treated with a seriousness out of proportion to its apparent content. The explorers noted this with puzzlement. They did not recognize what they were hearing. They were hearing geography. They were hearing route knowledge, encoded in narrative form and passed through generations, precisely because it was too valuable to lose and too sensitive to write down. The mountain communities that held this knowledge were not peripheral to the subterranean silk network. They were essential to it. Without their willingness to guide traders through terrain unknown to the travelers, the high passes could not have been used at all. Without their maintenance of the stopping points, the specific locations where water and shelter were available, on routes that offered very little of either. The journey could not have been sustained. They were not hired guides. They were partners, operating within a relationship of mutual benefit old enough to have become embedded in the landscape itself, in the names of features and the roots of stories that preserved the network's geography long after the network's existence had been forgotten by everyone else. The mountain community was the route's memory, and memory, it turns out, is the most durable infrastructure ever built. The name is a useful paradox. The subterranean silk network not only predates silk by several thousand years, but silk, when it finally began, moving along these corridors in the first millennium, BCE, was probably not even among the most important things they carried. Silk was beautiful and valuable, and it moved across the ancient world in quantities that impress historians. But silk was a luxury. The goods that kept the earlier network alive, that justified its maintenance across millennia before silk existed as a trade commodity, were something far more fundamental. They were the materials without which civilization, in the most literal sense, could not have functioned. Consider tin. The Bronze Age, the period that defines human capability between roughly 3,300 and 1,200 BCE, during which the first cities rose, the first writing systems developed, the first complex states emerged, was built on bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, typically in a ratio of around 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. Without both metals, the alloy cannot be made. Without the alloy, the tools and weapons and vessels that Bronze Age civilization required cannot be produced. Copper was relatively widely available. The mountains of Oman, the deposits of Cyprus, the ore bodies of Anatolia, all provided workable copper at scale. But tin was extraordinarily rare. The major tin deposits of the ancient world that could have supplied the entire Middle Eastern bronze industry at the scale that period demands were located in a small number of distant places. The mountains of Afghanistan, the Erzgebirge range between what is now Germany and the Czech Republic, possibly the Taurus range in Anatolia. Getting Afghan tin to Mesopotamian smiths required exactly the kind of long-distance, highly organized movement that the subterranean silk network provided. This is the foundational cargo, tin and copper moving toward each other from opposite ends of the network, enabling the production of the single most transformative material of the ancient world. Without this flow, the Bronze Age as we know it, the pyramids, the palace civilizations, the first complex legal codes, does not happen. The subterranean silk was not a supplement to civilization. It was one of civilization's primary supply chains. Alongside the metals, the catalogue expands in directions that feel almost surreal in retrospect. Carnelian, the deep orange-red gemstone prized across the ancient world for its appearance in jewelry and ritual objects, arrived in Mesopotamian markets almost entirely from Gujarat in western India, a distance of over 2,000 kilometers in a volume that implies regular, organized movement. Chlorite vessels from the Giroft culture of southeastern Iran, intricately carved stone containers, were distributed across a range that puts them in simultaneous contact with the Oxus civilization, the Indus trading sphere, and the Elamite gateway network. Shell ornaments made from Indian Ocean species appear in highland steppe burials in Kazakhstan, 5,000 kilometers from the nearest ocean. Each of these finds is a data point. Assembled together, they form a picture of commercial activity operating at a scale that rewrites the conventional understanding of the ancient world's degree of connectivity. The Bronze Age Middle East was not a collection of isolated civilizations occasionally reaching out to touch one another. It was a deeply interconnected system of exchange, moving materials that individual civilizations could not produce for themselves and could not survive without. The network that enabled this movement was ancient, resilient, and invisible to the administrative apparatus of every empire that later claimed to have built the first roads. The roads had always been there. The empires built their roads on top of something far older, and called the thing they had covered with their own construction and origin. There is a category of trade good that does not appear in official inventories. It does not show up in the administrative tablets of Mesopotamian palaces or the cargo records of Indus port cities, not because it was not moving, but because the people who moved it understood something that every serious merchant in the ancient world eventually came to know. The most valuable things are the ones you do not declare. Archaeobotany, the science of recovering and analyzing plant remains from ancient sites, has in recent decades produced findings that conventional ancient history has been slow to absorb. The evidence is not dramatic in the way that lapis lazuli or bronze is dramatic. It comes in the form of charred seeds, pollen residues, chemical traces in ceramic vessels, and botanical identifications emerging from increasingly sensitive analytical techniques applied to materials sitting in storage at archaeological institutions for decades. What the evidence shows, assembled and interpreted, is that psychoactive and ritual plant substances were being traded across the subterranean silk network on a significant scale, centuries or millennia before any formal trade route existed to carry them. Cannabis is the clearest case. Its geographic origin is believed to be the steppe zone north of the Caspian and Aral Seas, the grasslands of what are now Kazakhstan and southern Russia, where wild cannabis populations still grow in abundance. But the archaeobotanical record places cannabis use and cultivation across an enormous range by the 3rd millennium BCE, in the Bactrian settlements of the Oxus Corridor, in the Indus Valley, in the highlands of the Zagros, in early Bronze Age sites at the western edge of the Iranian plateau. This distribution was not achieved by the plant itself. Cannabis does not naturally migrate thousands of kilometers from its origin zone in a few centuries. It was achieved by people who valued it enough to carry it, who passed it along the same corridors that carried the lapis and the tin. The Soma question runs deeper and more strangely. In the Rig Veda and the Avesta, the foundational sacred texts of the Indo-Iranian world, composed in a form that preserves very ancient material. There are extensive references to a ritual plant preparation called Soma in Sanskrit, Hauma in Avestan, described as a divine drink capable of producing states of altered consciousness and connecting its users to the sacred. The identification of what plant this preparation was made from has occupied scholars for generations, but the most consistent candidate, based on geographic distribution of the relevant botanical species, chemical profiles suggested by ritual descriptions and direct archaeological evidence, is ephedra, the shrubby mountain plant whose alkaloids produce stimulant and euphoric effects, and whose distribution in the Central Asian and Iranian highland zones corresponds precisely to the territories of the cultures who wrote most intensely about Soma and Hauma. At Gunur Tepe, the great Bronze Age city of the Oxus civilization in what is now Turkmenistan, Victor Sarianidi excavated a section of the site that he interpreted as an industrial-scale ritual substance preparation facility. Large ceramic vessels for fermentation and storage, specialized filtering containers, analysis confirming botanical residues of ephedra, cannabis, and poppy. This was not a corner of a kitchen. It was a dedicated complex, scaled for production that went beyond what any single community could consume. Ritual substances move like secrets because they must. Their value is inseparable from their controlled distribution. A preparation that anyone can make is not sacred. A preparation that arrives from a specific source, carried by specific people who understand its production, and delivered to specific recipients who know how to use it, that carries an authority that the material alone cannot supply. The trade in these substances was not incidental to the network's religious infrastructure. In many ways, it was the network's most carefully protected cargo, moved in the darkest part of the dark, by people who understood that what they were carrying was not just a plant, but a key. There is a puzzle that has occupied historians of ancient technology for as long as the field has existed. At roughly the same period in history, across civilizations that had no acknowledged contact, certain transformative inventions appear not once, in one place, and then slowly diffusing outward over centuries, but simultaneously or near simultaneously in multiple locations separated by enormous distances. Metallurgy, the wheel, fired ceramics of advanced sophistication, astronomical observation systems precise enough to predict eclipses, writing adjacent accounting methods. The standard explanation is parallel development, the idea that when human communities reach a certain level of social and technological complexity, certain solutions become almost inevitable, and different groups arrive at them independently. It is a reasonable explanation. It is also, in the light of what we now know about the subterranean silk network, possibly incomplete. Consider the sequence of early writing systems. Sumerian cuneiform emerges around 3200 BCE. Elamite, Proto-Elamite script appears within a century or two of that. The Indus Valley script, still undeciphered, but unmistakably, a systematic symbol system appears by 2600 BCE. Egyptian hieroglyphics develop in roughly the same window. These are not the same writing systems. They do not share most of their symbols or their grammatical structures. They were not copies of each other. But they share a foundational conceptual leap, the idea that symbols can represent information in a standardized way that allows a reader who was not present at the creation of a message to reconstruct its meaning. That conceptual leap, in every field of human endeavor, is the hardest step. What the subterranean silk network may have provided is not the invention, but the spark, the contact between communities at precisely the moment when the idea was new and fragile and needed only to be shown to another receptive mind, to germinate. A merchant arriving in a settlement where accounting records were kept on clay tablets, carrying goods from a community that had never seen the technique, could describe what he had seen. He might even carry an example. He would not understand the full system. He would only need to show that such a thing was possible, and the local intelligence would do the rest. Agricultural knowledge moved the same way. Specific crop varieties, strains of emmer wheat, adapted to highland conditions, varieties of barley selected for drought resistance, appear in regions separated by mountain ranges at dates that suggest movement rather than independent development. The genetics of domesticated animals trace paths that follow the network corridors with a fidelity difficult to explain without positing regular human-mediated transfer. Irrigation techniques that required specialized engineering knowledge turn up at sites on both sides of geographic barriers, within time spans too short for independent invention to account for, in a consistent pattern suggesting that someone who knew the technique traveled through and shared it. Knowledge in the subterranean silk world was not philanthropy, it was merchandise. A metal worker who understood a new smelting technique did not give the knowledge away out of generosity. He traded it for goods, protection, or preferential access to raw materials. A community that held a monopoly on a specific agricultural process had a trade advantage that motivated them to protect and monetize the knowledge before it spread. The network functioned as the world's first information economy, moving not just materials but the ideas embedded in those materials and the expertise required to make use of them. This may be the network's most significant and most invisible legacy. The things it moved that left no physical trace, the concepts, the techniques, the questions that could only be asked by minds that had been exposed to a different way of doing something, shaped the development of every major civilization that emerged along its corridors. The lapis is beautiful. The bronze was useful. But the ideas may have been the most important cargo of all. There is a civilization that the popular history of the ancient world has consistently underestimated, misrepresented, and in many cases simply omitted. It appears in the margins of Mesopotamian history as a persistent irritant to the Akkadian Empire, as the captors of the statue of Naram-Sin, as the people who famously carried off the Code of Hammurabi to their capital at Susa, where it remained until archaeologists found it there in 1901. In the standard narrative, Elam appears as a secondary character, a supporting actor in the drama of Mesopotamian civilization. In the story of the subterranean silk, it is something else entirely. One of the network's most important organizing powers, and possibly its most essential western gateway. Elam occupied a territory that straddled two fundamentally different worlds. Its lowland capital at Susa sat in the floodplains of Khuzestan, close enough to Mesopotamia to participate directly in the commercial and political dynamics of the great river valley civilizations. Its highland territories extended deep into the Zagros Mountains, the folded, cave-riddled ranges that separate the Mesopotamian lowlands from the Iranian plateau and beyond. This geographic position was not merely interesting, it was commercially decisive. Elam sat at the exact point where everything coming from the east, the lapis, the tin, the carnelian, the ritual substances, the agricultural technologies moving out of the highland and plateau zones, had to pass through on its way to the cities of Mesopotamia. There was no route from the Iranian plateau to Mesopotamia that did not go through or immediately adjacent to Elamite territory. Elam was the gate. The administrative tablets from Susa that survive from the late 4th and 3rd millennia BCE are among the most revealing documents in the archaeology of ancient trade and among the least discussed outside specialist circles. These tablets record the receipt and redistribution of goods in quantities and from sources that the conventional account of Elamite civilization cannot explain through local production alone. Large quantities of lapis appear in administrative contexts, where the material's origin is noted as Eastern, a direction that points unambiguously toward Afghanistan. Tin ingots arrive in volumes sufficient to supply a bronze industry larger than Elam's own production capacity would require. Aromatic resins, herbal preparations, exotic stones from the east and the south, all moving through Susa's administrative apparatus in flows that imply not occasional receipt, but systematic management of a sustained incoming stream. Elam was not a passive recipient of goods that happened to pass through its territory. The administrative complexity visible in the Susa tablets, the standardized weights, the specialized accounting categories, the evident network of agents operating at multiple stages of movement suggests an active commercial intelligence, aware of what was available, where it was needed, and what could be earned by facilitating movement between the two. Elam managed the relay. It understood the Eastern suppliers and the Western consumers, and positioned itself as the indispensable intermediary in a relationship that both sides needed. For over 2,000 years, from approximately 3,200 BCE to the Assyrian destruction of Susa in 646 BCE, Elam maintained this position through the rise and fall of the Akkadian Empire, through the collapse of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, through the emergence of Babylon, through the early expansion of the Assyrian state. Empires came and went around it, and Elam absorbed, adapted, and continued. The commercial foundation that the subterranean silk network provided was more durable than any political arrangement its neighbors could construct, because it was not built on political arrangements at all. It was built on geography and on knowledge of geography, and those two things do not change when kings die and dynasties fall. Elam is the ghost at the feast of ancient history, present at every major moment, rarely acknowledged as the reason any of it was possible. Until the second half of the 20th century, the land between the Hindu Kush Mountains and the Aral Sea was assumed, by historians of the ancient world, to be an empty space. Central Asia in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE was thought to have been sparsely inhabited by pastoral nomads, people who moved with their herds across the Great Steppe, leaving no permanent settlements and no significant cultural footprint. The ancient centers of civilization, the thinking went, were to the west in Mesopotamia and Egypt, to the south in the Indus Valley, and eventually to the east in China. Central Asia was a corridor, not a destination. A space goods moved through, rather than a place where anything of consequence was made. The Soviet excavations that began in the 1970s demolished this picture with an efficiency that the academic world has never quite finished absorbing. In the river deltas of the Mughab and Amu Darya, the ancient Oxus, and in the Piedmont oases between the Kopet Dagh Range and the Karakum Desert, archaeologists began uncovering the remains of a Bronze Age civilization so extensive and so sophisticated that it had to be given a formal designation, the Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex. The name is academic and unwieldy. The reality it describes is extraordinary. At its peak between approximately 2,300 and 1,700 BCE, the Oxus civilization occupied a territory extending across what are now the southern portions of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and northern Afghanistan. Its largest sites, Gonu-Tepe, Togolok, Kelali, Dashli, were walled urban centers with populations that by any reasonable estimate rivaled the cities of Mesopotamia and the Indus. Their metallurgical output demonstrates access to a range of raw materials, copper, tin, gold, silver, lead, that could not have been locally sourced and must have arrived through trade. Their ceramics, seals, and decorative objects show an iconographic vocabulary that deliberately combines motifs drawn from Mesopotamian, Indus, and steppe traditions, not randomly, but in ways that suggest intentional synthesis, as if the craftsmen were working in a visual language designed to be recognizable to audiences from multiple cultural backgrounds. This is the signature of a commercial culture. When a civilization develops art that speaks simultaneously to the aesthetic conventions of its neighbors in every direction, it is not doing so by accident. It is signaling to the people it trades with that it understands their world, shares their references, and can be trusted as a partner in exchange. The Oxus civilization sat at the geographic center of the network that connected South Asia, the Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, and the Eurasian steppe. Every major trade corridor of the Bronze Age passed through or immediately adjacent to its territory. It was not peripheral to the subterranean silk. It was the network's hub. The most puzzling thing about the Oxus civilization is not its sophistication. It is its silence. No later civilization claimed it as an ancestor. No ancient text refers to it by a recognizable name. The people of classical antiquity who wrote about Central Asia, Herodotus, Strabo, Arrian, seemed unaware that anything of comparable importance had existed there 1,500 years before their own time. The civilization had disappeared so thoroughly that it left no legend. It appears in no founding myth. The vast cities were swallowed by the desert, and the memory of them was swallowed with the cities, and the world moved on without leaving any trace that it had lost something. The reason for this silence may itself be the network. A civilization that organized itself around trade, around the movement of goods, rather than the assertion of military power, does not generate the kind of records that survive. It does not leave victory steles or royal inscriptions. It leaves the goods themselves, scattered across the territories of its trading partners, recognizable to archaeologists and invisible to historians. The Oxus civilization shouted its existence in objects and whispered it in words, and history heard the words and missed the shout. In the year 2600 BCE, at the same moment that Queen Puabi was being buried in Ur and the Lapis mines of Sarisang were supplying her headdress with their blue stone, a civilization was flourishing in the river valleys of what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, that was, by almost every measurable standard of urban sophistication, the most advanced in the world. Its territory exceeded that of Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. Its two largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro on the Indus and Harappa in the Punjab, had populations numbering in the tens of thousands and urban infrastructure that Europe would not match until the Roman period. Grid-planned streets with standardized block dimensions, a municipal water supply and sewage system that carried waste away from residences through covered drains, public bathhouses and granaries of a scale that implies sophisticated communal organization. Its weights and measures were standardized across the entire civilizational territory, with a consistency that implies not local convention, but an enforced common system, a system designed for commercial use, for trade that crossed the borders between communities and required a shared language of quantity. And yet, the Indus civilization left almost no record of itself that scholars can read. Its script, hundreds of distinct signs arranged in sequences on small steatite tablets, remains undeciphered after a century of intense scholarly attention. Its religious practices are inferred from objects rather than described in texts. Its political organization is debated. The Indus civilization, one of the great achievements of the ancient world, stands before history with its face partially obscured, present in its objects, absent in its words. What it left in abundance is evidence of commercial reach. Indus seals, the small carved steatite tablets stamped with the undeciphered script, and the images of animals that are the civilization's most distinctive artistic product, have been found at sites across the Persian Gulf, in the Mesopotamian cities of Ur and Lagash, in the port settlements of Oman and Bahrain, and at Oxus civilization sites in Central Asia. These seals functioned as commercial identity documents. Pressed into soft clay alongside a package of goods, they identified the origin, the sender, and perhaps the quality guarantee of whatever they accompanied. The fact that Indus seals appear across such an enormous range tells a story about the civilization's commercial ambition that its buildings and drainage systems only hint at. The Indus weight system is equally eloquent. Sets of cubical stone weights conforming to the Indus Standard Ratio series have been recovered not just across the civilization's home territory, but in contexts suggesting their use in multilateral commercial negotiations far from home, as if the Indus Standard was accepted, at least in some trading contexts, as a neutral reference that parties from different cultural backgrounds could both respect. This is the function of a reserve currency applied to the world of weights and measures, a common standard that facilitates exchange between parties who share no other common language. What the Indus civilization's standardization implies about its internal organization is important. Civilizations do not achieve absolute consistency in brick dimensions, weight ratios, and urban planning layouts through accident or local convention. They achieve it through coordinated effort, through some mechanism that reaches across 1,000 kilometers of territory and ensures that a trader arriving in a city he has never visited before can measure, weigh, and package his goods in ways that the local market will accept without question. That mechanism was oriented outward. It was designed to facilitate exchange with the world beyond the Indus valleys. The Indus civilization did not merely participate in the subterranean silk network. It may have been one of the network's primary architects, building into its own civic infrastructure the tools that long-distance trade required, and deploying those tools across the length and breadth of the ancient commercial world. The most commercially sophisticated civilization of the ancient world left almost nothing in writing. What it left instead was a system. And systems, unlike words, do not require translation to be understood. Language is the foundation of commerce. Not any specific language, but the capacity for shared meaning. The agreement between two parties that a particular sign, a particular gesture, a particular sequence of marks carries specific and reliable content. Without that agreement, there is no transaction, only exchange at the most primitive level. With it, commerce can function across linguistic barriers, across cultural distances, across the vast geographic separations that characterized every significant trade relationship in the ancient world. The people who maintained the subterranean silk network were not, for the most part, speakers of the same language. A Badakhshani Lapis trader, a Helmandi beadmaker, an Elamite gatekeeper, and a Mesopotamian goldsmith would have had no tongue in common. Their spoken languages were as different from one another as English is from Mandarin. And yet their commercial relationships functioned reliably and over centuries in ways that required some form of shared communication. Something was traveling with the goods that told the recipient what they were, where they came from, and who sent them. On the surfaces of objects moving through the network, on the chlorite vessels of the Geographers culture, on the steatite tablets of the Indus, on the early cylinder seals of Elam, on obsidian trading items from Anatolia that date to the 5th and 4th millennia BCE, there appear carved marks that do not belong cleanly to any of the recognized ancient writing systems, but that share, across these different contexts, a consistency of form that is difficult to explain without positing some form of shared convention. Circles with interior marks, intersecting lines in specific configurations, specific animal representations in specific postures. These are not decorative choices made independently by different artistic traditions. They are signs that recur with enough frequency and enough geographic distribution to suggest that communities agreed at some point in the development of the network on what certain marks meant. The Geographers connection is particularly suggestive. The chlorite vessels of the Geographers culture, produced in the Halil Rud Valley of southeastern Iran in the 3rd millennium BCE, carry an iconographic vocabulary that researchers including Youssef Majid-Zadeh and Massimo Vidale have identified as sharing significant overlap with elements of the Indus Valley script. The two traditions are not identical, but they share enough specific formal elements to suggest either direct contact or derivation from a common visual language developed in the context of the shared commercial environment that the subterranean silk network created. What the merchant's mark did, in practical terms, was make accountability possible in the absence of a shared legal system. A package of lapis beads arriving in Mesopotamia from the east bore, somewhere on its exterior, a mark that identified its origin and its sender. The recipient community knew what that mark meant, not because they had studied the full symbol system of the Helmand workshops, but because in the commercial relationship between the two communities, certain marks had acquired agreed-upon meanings through repetition and reinforcement over many transactions. The mark was a reputation, compressed into a symbol. A seal that carried a mark associated with consistently high-quality goods was worth more than the same seal without that mark. This commercial semiotics did not require literacy in the modern sense. It required something older, and in some ways more sophisticated: the ability to maintain and recognize a shared system of meaning across cultural and linguistic distances without any institution to enforce it, sustained by nothing more than mutual benefit and the memory of transactions that had gone well before. The marks were not written contracts. They were promises made in stone, durable enough to outlast the people who made them, and specific enough to be recognized by people who had never met. The oldest language of commerce was not spoken. It was carved. And it moved, with the goods it authenticated, across the full length of the ancient world. At some point in the middle of the 4th millennium BCE, the exact date varies by region, but the window is consistent enough to be meaningful. A new object appears in the material record of communities across an enormous swath of the ancient world. It is small, usually fitting comfortably in the palm of a hand. It is made from stone, bone, or fired clay, carved or molded with a distinctive design. When pressed into a surface of soft material, wet clay, fresh plaster, the sealed neck of a storage jar, it leaves a clear impression of that design, unmistakable, specific, and impossible to replicate without access to the original. This object is the seal, and its appearance across the region, in the same general period, in the same commercial contexts, is one of the most eloquent pieces of evidence that the subterranean silk network existed as a functioning system requiring formal mechanisms of accountability. The seal solved a problem that long-distance commerce faces in every era. How do you trust someone you cannot see? When a package of goods left one community and traveled through several intermediary hands before arriving at its destination, the recipient had no way to verify that what arrived was what had been agreed upon, in the quantity and quality expected, from the sender who had promised it. Without some mechanism of verification, every transaction beyond direct personal contact was a gamble. The seal provided the mechanism. A package sealed with the distinctive impression of a known sender's stone could not be tampered with without the tampering being visible. A quantity of goods weighed before sealing and notated in clay against the sealed impression created a verifiable record that survived the journey even when the messenger who carried it did not. The variety of seal traditions that converged along the subterranean silk network is itself evidence of the network's extent. Mesopotamian cylinder seals, cylindrical stones rolled across clay to leave a continuous frieze of imagery, are among the most studied objects in ancient Near Eastern archaeology. The Indus stamp seals, square or rectangular steatite tablets with a loop on the reverse for gripping, are equally well documented, though less well understood. Less familiar, but critically important, are the intercultural seals of the Oxus civilization, identified and named by scholars studying the distribution of Bronze Age objects across Central Asia. These intercultural seals are objects unlike any produced by a single cultural tradition. They combine Mesopotamian iconographic elements, specific animal combat scenes, divine figures in recognizable Sumerian postures, with Indus-style geometric layouts, and Oxus civilization animal subjects, in compositions that feel deliberately synthetic. They are not the work of a craftsman drawing on their own tradition and occasionally borrowing from others. They are the work of someone who understood multiple traditions well enough to combine them into a single object that would be legible to audiences from several different cultural backgrounds simultaneously. They are, in effect, multilingual objects, commercial passports designed to operate in a world where identity meant different things to different audiences. The Dilmun seals found across the Persian Gulf trading zone add a further dimension. Dilmun, the ancient name for Bahrain and the surrounding coastal area, occupied the geographic center of the Gulf trade network, positioned between the Indus commercial sphere to the east, the Mesopotamian markets to the north, and the Omani copper sources to the south. Dilmun seals, with their distinctive stamp seal format and characteristic designs, appear in all three of these trading zones. Functioning apparently as a recognized neutral standard, accepted as a guarantee of legitimate commercial identity by parties from multiple cultural traditions who might otherwise have had no common framework for establishing trust. The distribution of seal types across the network maps something that no written document of the period acknowledges: a commercial infrastructure that stretched from the Indus Delta to the Persian Gulf to the cities of Mesopotamia, maintained by communities who had agreed, without any central authority to enforce the agreement, on a set of physical objects that would serve as the common language of commercial accountability. The seals made trust portable, and portable trust made the network possible. Every transaction they authenticated was an act of faith in a system that nobody had designed, that nobody fully understood, and that somehow kept working across centuries and thousands of kilometers of complicated terrain. That is not a small thing. That may be one of the most significant things human beings have ever quietly built. Among the most consistent patterns in the archaeology of the subterranean Silk Network is one that becomes visible only when the distribution of trade goods is examined alongside the distribution of sacred sites. Wherever the material evidence concentrates most densely, the lapis fragments, the metal ingots, the exotic ceramics, the foreign seal impressions, there is almost always a place of ritual significance at or near the same location. A temple, a fire altar, a hilltop shrine, a sacred spring, a deposit of votive objects carefully accumulated over centuries. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, and the character of these sites is too distinctive to be explained by the general proliferation of sacred spaces that characterized the ancient world. The shrines along the subterranean Silk Network share several features that distinguish them from the general background of ancient religiosity. They are located at geographic transition points, the junctions of valleys, the summits of passes, the points where one terrain type gives way to another, the river crossings and mountain approaches that serve as natural decision points for travelers. They contain in their votive deposits objects that came from multiple cultural traditions: an Indus-style bead alongside an Elamite seal, alongside an Oxus bronze beside a Mesopotamian cylinder, all deposited in the same accumulation, speaking to use by travelers from different origins who shared this space and its sacred character, even if they shared nothing else. They also contain evidence of practical infrastructure alongside the ritual one. Storage areas, water management features, areas that archaeologists have tentatively identified as communal rest zones, the remnants of food processing and preparation that suggest significant numbers of people spending organized, sustained time at these sites. The sacred and the practical are woven together in the physical fabric of these places in ways that resist clean separation. The fire temples along the Kopet Dağ foothills are among the clearest examples. These structures, which predate Zoroastrianism in its formal sense, but appear to represent an ancestor of the fire worship tradition that Zoroastrianism later systematized, are positioned along the Piedmont corridor between northeastern Iran and the Turkmen steppe, precisely the route that connects the Elamite gateway to the Oxus civilization's southern trading zone. Their ritual deposits include material from both sides of the mountain range. Their physical design includes features storage rooms, water access, sheltered areas that would have served travelers as well as worshippers. The boundary between the two categories at these sites is difficult to locate. The goddess shrines excavated at Oxus civilization sites in the Amu Darya corridor are even more explicit. The associated material culture, the quantities of stored goods, the administrative objects, the evidence of standardized weighing and measuring suggests a commercial function operating in parallel with the religious one. At these shrines, traders gathered not just to make offerings, but to exchange information, route conditions, current prices in distant markets, the reliability of specific trading partners, the political situation in territories ahead. In a world without written newspapers or postal systems, the sacred waypoint was where you learned what you needed to know to make the next leg of the journey safely. This dual function, sacred space and information exchange, was not a contradiction in the ancient mind. It was a logical design. The protection of a deity's sacred territory made a waypoint safe for parties who might otherwise be in competition or conflict. The concentrated presence of traders from multiple origins at a shared religious site created exactly the social conditions in which information could be exchanged freely, because the sacred context imposed a temporary truce on the normal dynamics of commercial rivalry. The shrine was the ancient world's most sophisticated networking event, and the deity, whose authority enforced the peace, was the unknowing host of the most important commercial intelligence operation in the ancient Near East. The line that modern thinking draws between religion and economics is one of the most misleading inheritances of the post-Enlightenment world. It suggests that these are naturally separate domains, that the sacred and the commercial occupy different spaces in human life, and that their mixing represents a corruption or a category error. This idea would have been incomprehensible to the people who ran the ancient world's most powerful institutions. For them, the temple was the economy, the deity was the landowner, the priests were the executives, and the commerce that flowed through the institution's hands was simultaneously a religious obligation and a commercial operation, with no boundary between the two that anyone would have thought to draw. Temple institutions in Mesopotamia, Elam, and the Indus held land, managed labor, operated storage and distribution systems at scale, extended credit, and conducted what can only be described as a form of monetary policy, regulating the flow of goods through the economy of their cities in ways that made them the most powerful economic actors in the ancient world. The Temple of Inanna at Uruk, the Ekur at Nippur, the temples of Inshushinak at Susa. These were not places people visited on holy days. They were the institutions around which economic life in their cities was organized. The Elamite temple system is particularly relevant to the story of the subterranean silk. The temples of Inshushinak at Susa received goods from the east in quantities that temple administrative tablets document with careful precision. The goods are noted as arrivals from the eastern direction, which in Elamite administrative geography means the Iranian plateau and beyond. They are received, recorded, and redistributed, some to Mesopotamian partners, who pay for them in silver and grain, and some to the deity's own accounts, which is to say, to the temple's operational reserves. What this administrative language obscures, and what the physical evidence suggests, is that the temple's eastern suppliers were not simply merchants selling to an institutional buyer. They were partners in a relationship that had religious as well as commercial dimensions. The goods they delivered were understood, in the Elamite framework, as belonging to the deity as tributaries in a sacred economy where the divine authority of Inshushinak guaranteed the legitimacy of the exchange and the safety of the parties involved. An attack on a merchant operating under divine patronage was an attack on the deity. The consequences were not legal, they were cosmic. This religious framing gave the network something that pure commercial relationships cannot provide: a deterrent against predation that operated on the level of shared belief rather than enforced law. The priest-merchant did not need to hire guards. The deity was the guard. The commercial intelligence that temple networks accumulated over generations of managing these flows was extraordinary. Which eastern suppliers were reliable, which routes were currently safe, what the going exchange rate was for lapis against silver in the current season. This knowledge was institutional, surviving the deaths of individual administrators and accumulating across generations in ways that no individual merchant's memory could achieve. The temple was not just a commercial partner. It was the network's memory, its archive, and its most sophisticated intelligence asset. The priest-merchant is one of history's most consistently misread figures. He appears in the archaeological record as a religious functionary, and in the economic record as a commercial operator. And the historians who study one set of records rarely consult the other. But in the ancient world, the two roles were the same role. And the institution that combined them was the most powerful thing in the ancient Near East, precisely because no one looking for commercial power thought to look inside a temple. In the early 20th century, an Ottoman-era excavation at the site of Kültepe in central Anatolia began uncovering clay tablets by the thousands. The site was the ancient city of Qanesh, once home to a trading colony of old Assyrian merchants who had established a commercial outpost there around 1900 BCE, and the tablets fired accidentally in a conflagration that destroyed the colony but preserved the contents of its archive. Turned out to be one of the most extraordinary documentary collections in the history of the ancient Near East. They were business letters, contracts, dispute records, shipping instructions, price negotiations, loan documents, the complete paper trail of a long-distance textile trade that sent woven goods from the city of Assur in northern Mesopotamia to markets in Anatolia and returned with silver and gold. What the Kültepe tablets revealed about women was something that conventional history had been quietly not discussing for a very long time. The women of Assur were not passive beneficiaries of their husbands' commercial success. They were active participants, in some cases the primary operators, in the textile production and quality control networks that supplied the trade. Women's letters in the Kültepe archive do not confine themselves to domestic topics. They give explicit shipping instructions to husbands and sons operating in Anatolia. They dispute the quality of goods received in technical language that demonstrates sophisticated familiarity with textile production standards. They demand payment for specific deliveries. They manage credit relationships with other households. They make investment decisions about how much to produce for the next season, based on their reading of market conditions in a city they had possibly never visited. What the Kültepe archive documents in the old Assyrian trading colony applies, this story argues, across the broader social structure of the subterranean silk network. The domestic sphere in the ancient world was not what the word domestic has come to imply in modern usage. A realm separate from economic life, a space of private routine disconnected from the workings of the larger world. In the ancient world, the domestic sphere was the economy's foundation. Textile production, the primary commodity of long-distance trade in almost every period of ancient history, happened in households managed and produced by women. Herbal knowledge, including knowledge of the ritual plant preparations that formed one of the network's most sensitive cargo categories, was held primarily in domestic contexts, transmitted through female lineages. The preservation and processing of food goods for long-distance transport was domestic work. Women held, in other words, the primary technical knowledge base for the network's most important cargo categories. They knew which textiles were of genuine quality and which had been produced with inferior fiber or lazy technique. They knew which herbal preparations were correctly made and which were not. They knew which trading partners had historically paid on time and which had a pattern of disputing agreements after receipt. In a network that operated on trust and reputation rather than legal contract, this was the most valuable knowledge there was. When empires began to impose administrative control over the trade routes of the ancient world, they consistently targeted the visible layers of commercial activity: the merchants moving through checkpoints, the goods passing through official markets, the transactions recorded in administrative archives. They did not and could not control the domestic layer, the knowledge held in households, transmitted in conversations that generated no written record, embedded in the memories of women whose names appear in almost no history of the ancient world. The network's domestic infrastructure was, by its nature, invisible to official scrutiny. It could not be taxed, it could not be monitored, it could not be confiscated. And it could not, as every empire that tried to control the network eventually discovered, be eliminated. The women of the route outlasted every administration that attempted to replace them. The archive at Kültepe was burned. The letters survived in the fire. Something in that symmetry feels appropriate. There is a principle that every serious long-distance trade network has learned, in every period of history, in every part of the world. You cannot move goods through mountain terrain without the cooperation of the people who live in those mountains. The physical difficulty of highland passage is not the primary obstacle. It is the knowledge required which paths are safe at which seasons, where the water is, which approaches are currently blocked by conflict or weather, which communities will offer shelter, and which will offer something considerably less hospitable. This knowledge is not written on maps. It is held in the memories of people whose families have inhabited the same ranges for generations. Without access to those people and their knowledge, a highland passage is not merely difficult, it is impossible. The mountain communities of the Zagros, the Elburz, the Kopet Dag, and the Hindu Kush understood this. Their position at the junctions between the great civilizational zones of the ancient world gave them leverage out of all proportion to their population or military capacity. They did not need armies to protect their position. They needed only to withhold their cooperation, to refuse the knowledge that made passage possible, and the trade would stop or route itself around them, which in highland terrain often amounted to the same thing. The Lur and Bakhtiari confederations of the central Zagros are a case that can be studied in unusual detail, because their transhumance routes the seasonal paths along which they moved. Their flocks between winter lowlands and summer highlands were still in active use in the modern period, and were documented by ethnographers in the 19th and 20th centuries. When those routes are plotted on a map, and compared with the distribution of ancient trade goods in the Zagros region, The overlap is striking enough to suggest not coincidence, but continuity. The mountain communities were using the same paths in the 19th century CE that their ancestors had used in the 3rd millennium BCE, because the terrain that made those paths optimal had not changed, and neither had the community's knowledge of that terrain. The Nuristani communities of the Hindu Kush, who maintained a trade intermediary role across the range well into the modern period, whose linguistic isolation suggests a cultural continuity stretching back to the Bronze Age, offer a parallel example. And the Pamiri mountain communities of the Wakhan corridor preserved root knowledge in the form of ritual narratives and geographic oral traditions that 19th century European explorers recorded with puzzlement, not recognizing them as the residue of an ancient commerce. What the mountain gatekeepers extracted in exchange for their cooperation is the most interesting question. Gold and silver were one form of payment, certainly. Specific goods, metals, textiles, the kind of portable value that a highland community with limited agricultural surplus could store and use were another. But the evidence of anthropological parallels across cultures suggests that the most valued form of payment may have been information itself. News from the lowland world, the political situations in the great cities, the current prices for goods that the highland communities traded or consumed, the movements of armies that might affect the safety of specific passes was worth more to a mountain community than any physical commodity. In exchange for this news, the gatekeepers provided what they alone possessed: route intelligence, safety guarantees, knowledge of current conditions in the high country. The exchange was precisely symmetrical, and it made the relationship between lowland merchant and highland gatekeeper something more complex and more durable than a simple commercial transaction. The highland gatekeepers were, in functional terms, the subterranean silk network's intelligence service, aggregating news from every caravan that passed through their territory, building a picture of the state of the world across an enormous range that no single lowland power could replicate. The mountain tribes who appear in the margins of ancient history as occasional raiders or problematic border populations were, in the architecture of the real economy, something rather more important. The people who kept the whole system informed. In 522 BCE, when Darius I consolidated control over the Achaemenid Empire after the chaos that followed Cambyses' death, he inherited a territory that stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the borders of India, the largest political entity the world had yet seen. The administrative challenge this presented was staggering, and Darius met it with a systematic intelligence and organizational capacity that has made him one of the most studied rulers in ancient history. He standardized weights and measures. He established a common currency. He built a postal relay system that could move a message from Susa to Sardis in 7 days. He constructed roads. The Royal Road, 2,700 kilometers of maintained, marked, and station-equipped highway connecting the western and eastern administrative centers of the empire, is the achievement that every textbook mentions. It is presented as a marvel of Persian administrative genius, and in some respects it was. But what the textbooks do not ask is what the Royal Road was built alongside, and what it was designed to make irrelevant. Because the Royal Road did not cut through empty space. It ran through a landscape already threaded with the roots of the subterranean silk network, and it was built at a width, along an alignment, and with an infrastructure of royal stations and military garrisons that made a very specific political argument. This road belongs to the king, and everything that moves along it can be seen, taxed, and controlled. The Zagros mountain routes that had served as the Elamite gateway for millennia were not wide enough for the royal road's alignment. They were bypassed. The qanat corridors of the central plateau were noted and incorporated into the empire's administrative geography, but not officially designated as trade routes, which meant that goods moving through them remained formally invisible to the imperial accounting system. The Persian administration knew, with the clarity of a bureaucratic intelligence, that goods were moving through channels it could not fully monitor. The Royal Road was the answer, not an attempt to close the invisible channels by force, but an attempt to make the visible alternative so attractive, so reliable, and so well serviced that merchants would choose it voluntarily. A merchant who chose the Royal Road gained the protection of Persian garrison troops, access to royal rest stations with standardized supplies, and a degree of legal protection for his goods that the informal network could not provide. He also gained, as the price of these benefits, visibility. His goods were recorded. He paid taxes at the official rates. He became, in administrative terms, a subject of the empire, rather than an actor in a system that predated and transcended it. Some merchants made this calculation and chose the royal road. The evidence suggests that a significant number did not. The distribution of pre-Silk Road trade goods in the Achaemenid period continues to show patterns inconsistent with the royal road alignment, suggesting that the informal network survived the construction of its official competitor by continuing to offer the one thing that the royal road could not: invisibility. For merchants carrying goods whose value lay partly in their untaxed status, whose trading relationships depended on a privacy that official routes could not guarantee, the underground corridors remained the only viable option. The Persian correction was the first great attempt to subsume the subterranean silk network within an imperial structure. It succeeded in capturing some of the trade. It failed to capture the network itself, and in failing, it set a precedent that every subsequent empire would repeat. When Alexander of Macedon crossed the Hellespont in 334 BCE, he carried with him an ambition that went beyond the conquest of Persia. He wanted to reach the end of the world, the Eastern Ocean, that Greek geographical theory placed beyond the farthest known lands. And in the course of that journey, he would pass through, dismantle, and attempt to reconstruct the commercial infrastructure of the most sophisticated trading zone in the ancient world. The violence of his campaigns in the East is well documented. What is less often examined is the commercial logic that ran alongside the military one. The destruction of Persepolis in 330 BCE is typically understood as an act of symbolic revenge for the Persian burning of Athens during Xerxes' invasion. This is accurate as far as it goes. But Persepolis was also the administrative heart of the system that had managed, however imperfectly, the commercial flow of the Achaemenid Empire. Its treasury records, its administrative archives, its network of officials who had overseen the taxation and routing of goods across the empire's eastern territories. All of this was disrupted by the destruction, and the disruption was not incidental to Alexander's purposes. A commercial system that someone else controls is a commercial system that controls you. Eliminating Persepolis eliminated the Persian Empire's commercial memory. The Bactrian campaigns of 329 to 327 BCE were more explicitly destructive of the trade infrastructure. The Sogdian and Bactrian communities whom Alexander faced in these years were not simply frontier peoples defending their homeland. They were the primary commercial operators of the subterranean silk network's Central Asian corridor. The communities, who maintained the relay chains between the Indus sphere, the Oxus civilization's surviving remnants, the steppe trading networks to the north, and the Iranian gateway to the west. The resistance Alexander encountered in this region, prolonged, fierce, and repeatedly resurging, was partly the resistance of people who understood that what was being attacked was not just their political independence, but the commercial system that was the basis of their entire way of life. Alexander's response included the destruction of several major Bactrian settlements and the forced displacement of their populations into new Greek-style foundations. The city-founding strategy, 12 or more Alexandrias, established along the routes of his march, was presented in ancient sources as a civilizing mission. In commercial terms, it was something more calculated. Each Alexandria was placed at a geographic junction of significance: a river crossing, a mountain approach, an oasis that served as a natural waypoint for trade routes crossing in multiple directions. The placement was not accidental. Alexander's planners understood the commercial geography of the network well enough to position their foundations at exactly the points that controlled it. A new city at a trade junction, populated by Greek settlers and administered by Greek officials, did not simply add a new node to the existing network. It replaced the indigenous commercial community that had previously occupied and managed that junction communities with generations of embedded knowledge about the routes they controlled, the trading relationships they maintained, and the trust networks they had built with partners in every direction. That knowledge lived in people and in relationships rather than in documents. When the indigenous community was destroyed or displaced, the knowledge went with it. The long-term consequences of this disruption were significant. In the Bactrian region in particular, The density and reliability of the relay chains that had characterized the subterranean silk network during the Bronze Age did not return to their previous levels. The Hellenistic kingdoms that succeeded Alexander's empire maintained long-distance trade along the major arteries, but the finer mesh of informal routes, the secondary valleys, the high passes, the non-official corridors that had given the network its resilience, was thinner after the Alexandrian disruption than it had been before. The invisible network had been damaged, for the first time in its long history, by something more thorough than any previous imperial intervention. It survived, but it remembered the wound, and it would spend the next few centuries reconstituting itself in the cracks of every empire that came after. In 138 BCE, a court official named Zhang Qian left the Han capital at Chang'an, carrying a diplomatic commission and very little else that would prove useful in the months ahead. His mission was to reach the Yuezhi people, a nomadic group that had been pushed westward from the Chinese borderlands and was now somewhere in the vast territories to the west, and negotiate an alliance against the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation that had been raiding the Han Empire's northern frontier with a consistency that the court found intolerable. Zhang Qian would spend the next 13 years in transit, captured and held by the Xiongnu, finally escaping and reaching the Yuezhi, only to find them comfortable in their new territory and entirely disinterested in any proposed alliance. He returned to Chang'an, having failed in his diplomatic objective, and yet the Han Emperor Wudi received him as if he had brought back something more valuable than any alliance. Because what Zhang Qian brought back was knowledge. Detailed descriptions of the peoples, cities, products, and commerce networks of the territories to the west of China. His account of the western regions of Fergana's famed horses, of Bactria's markets, of the long-distance movement of goods already underway across Central Asia, was the catalyst for the Han Dynasty's systematic engagement with the routes that would later be called the Silk Road. But here is the question that Zhang Qian's famous journey should prompt, and rarely does. What was he traveling through? Not empty space, not a blank territory waiting to be opened to exchange. He was moving through a landscape that had been commercially active for over 2,000 years, through communities that had been maintaining trading relationships across these routes since the Bronze Age, that had developed the infrastructure, the trust networks, the relay chains, and the geographic knowledge that made long-distance movement possible. The routes that Zhang Qian traveled were not new. His report of them was not a discovery. It was a recognition, the first formal acknowledgement by the Han imperial apparatus, that something existed out there that could be incorporated into the empire's commercial strategy. The Silk Road was not opened. It was renamed. The consequences of that recognition were transformative, and not entirely in ways that the network's existing operators would have welcomed. The Han Dynasty's response to Zhang Qian's report was systematic and strategic. The Hexi Corridor, the narrow strip of territory between the Tibetan Plateau and the Gobi Desert that connected the Han heartland to Central Asia, was secured with a chain of fortified way stations and military garrisons. The Tarim Basin oasis cities that had been functioning as independent commercial nodes were brought into a tributary relationship with the Han court. Officials were established at the key junctions of the route system, with the dual mandate of facilitating trade for Han merchants and recording the commercial activity of everyone else. Facilitation and monitoring, in the Han administrative model, were not in tension. They were the same activity. A way station that supplied water and fodder to passing merchants also noted who those merchants were and what they were carrying. A garrison that protected the route from bandit attacks also ensured that the goods moving along it were declared and taxed. The official Silk Road was, at its administrative core, a surveillance and taxation infrastructure wrapped in a commercial amenity. For the subterranean silk network, the Han engagement was the most sophisticated challenge it had yet faced. The Persians had tried to build a better alternative. Alexander had tried to destroy the indigenous operators and replace them with loyal successors. The Han did something more subtle. They built their official road along the same routes that the informal network used, made it attractive enough to capture a significant share of the traffic, and used the resulting visibility to document and tax what they could reach, while acknowledging implicitly that there was always a layer of commercial activity they could not reach, moving through corridors their garrisons had not found or could not patrol. The Silk Road that history celebrates was built in this period. It was real. It was important. But it was built on a foundation that was already there, a foundation it renamed without understanding and taxed without being able to eliminate. Beneath the famous road, the quieter one kept moving. In the winter of 2000, the Halil Rud River in southeastern Iran flooded with unusual severity, cutting new channels through the dry landscape and eroding the edges of low mounds that had accumulated without attracting particular attention. What the flood exposed, in a cemetery sealed since the 3rd millennium BCE, was the beginning of one of the most remarkable and most contested archaeological stories of the 21st century. Objects began appearing on the illegal antiquities market that winter, and into the following year, objects of such unusual character that museums and dealers who encountered them initially assumed they were forgeries. The carvings were too sophisticated, the iconography too distinctive, the cultural context too unfamiliar to fit any previously known category of ancient Near Eastern art. The objects were chlorite vessels, containers carved from the dark, soft stone with an intricacy and visual vocabulary that had no obvious precedent in the archaeological record. Animals locked in combat, half-human figures emerging from architectural settings, geometric patterns organized with a mathematical precision that implied a well-developed design tradition. The Iranian archaeologist Yusuf Majidzadeh, who was eventually authorized to conduct systematic excavations at the site, argued in a series of papers that these objects represented not a local artistic tradition operating at the margins of the ancient world, but the product of a major Bronze Age civilization, centered in the Halil Rud Valley, that had been entirely unknown to scholarship before the flood exposed its graves. He called it the geographer culture, and the debate about its significance and its relationships to other ancient Near Eastern civilizations has continued ever since. What is not in dispute is the distribution of the objects it produced. Chlorite vessels in the geographer style have been documented at sites across the Persian Gulf, at Mesopotamian urban contexts, at Oxus civilization sites in Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, and in the Indus trading sphere. They appear wherever the distribution of pre-Silk Road trade goods is densest, which is to say, they appear at exactly the points that the subterranean silk network's relay chains would have passed through on their way between east and west. The nearby site of Shari Sokhta, known in English as the Burnt City, a reference to the conflagration that destroyed it around 2100 BCE, adds a further dimension. At its peak in the late 3rd millennium BCE, Shari Sokhta was one of the largest settlements in the world by territory, sprawling across an area of over 150 hectares in the Helmand River basin near the Afghan border. Excavations there over several decades have revealed a city whose economic life was organized to an extraordinary degree around the processing and redistribution of materials arriving from multiple source regions. Workshop floors in the city's craft districts are deep with the debris of industrial-scale production. Lapis lazuli chips from the cutting and drilling of beads, copper slag from smelting operations, the remnants of Carnelian processing. The raw materials arrive from Afghanistan, from Oman, from India. The finished products leave in all directions. This is not an incidental manufacturing city that happened to have access to raw materials. This is a purpose-built commercial processing center, located at a geographic junction that places it within reach of the Afghan highland sources to the north, the Indian trading sphere to the southeast, the Elamite gateway to the west, and the Oxus civilization corridor to the northeast. The Burnt City was the network's workshop, the place where raw materials from across the ancient world were transformed into finished goods for redistribution. The flood that revealed the Jiroft cemetery was accidental. What it uncovered was anything but. The ground had been keeping this secret for 4,000 years, and it was finally ready to release it. And what came out of the ground was not the edge of something small. It was the center of something very large indeed. For 4 decades, a Greek-Russian archaeologist named Victor Sarianidi excavated a site in the Murghab Delta of what is now Turkmenistan that he believed was the most important Bronze Age discovery since Schliemann found Troy. He was loud about this belief, colorful in his argumentation, and frequently in conflict with colleagues who found his interpretations too ambitious. He died in 2013 with his most provocative claim that the site of Gonur Tepe was the homeland of Zoroastrianism, the birthplace of one of the world's oldest surviving religious traditions, still unresolved in the scholarly literature. But the physical evidence he extracted from the site over those 4 decades tells a commercial story that is, if anything, more significant than the religious hypothesis. Gonur Tepe, at its peak, between roughly 2,300 and 1,800 BCE, was a walled urban complex covering approximately 30 hectares, with a palatial precinct at its center, featuring a structure of considerable sophistication, surrounded by residential and commercial districts, extensive storage facilities, and specialized workshop areas. The storage capacity of the site, measured in the volume of the pits and rooms, whose contents Sarianidi catalogued, was disproportionate to what any community of Gonur's population could produce for itself. Material was arriving and being held. The city was managing the flow of goods through a geography it controlled. The commercial connections visible in Gonur's material culture are extraordinary. Oxus civilization, metalwork, the distinctive bronze and copper objects produced in these workshops, with their characteristic animal combat imagery and specific alloy compositions, has been found at Indus Valley sites, in the Persian Gulf trading zone, in Mesopotamian commercial contexts, and in the Aegean. Oxus seals appear in contexts across the entire range of the subterranean silk network. The iconographic vocabulary of Gonur's own decorative objects draws from Mesopotamian, Indus, and steppe traditions simultaneously, in a synthesis that could only have been produced by craftsmen embedded in a commercial culture in daily contact with all of these worlds. The section of Gonur that Sarianidi identified as a ritual substance preparation complex is among the site's most striking discoveries. The evidence, he presented large ceramic vessels of specific shapes, consistent with fermentation and storage, filtering containers. Botanical residues was analyzed by specialists who confirmed the presence of ephedra, cannabis, and poppy in the associated organic material. Whatever specific religious identification one accepts or rejects, the scale of the preparation activity implied by the physical evidence exceeds what any internal ritual function would require. Something was being produced at Gonur in quantities designed for distribution, and distribution, in the context of a city this well connected commercially, means the network. The cemetery at Gonur, with thousands of excavated burials, provides a further type of evidence that is sometimes overlooked. The skeletal analysis of the buried population reveals patterns of dietary isotopes and physical markers that suggest a community assembled from across a wide geographic range. Individuals whose childhood nutrition patterns indicate origins in multiple different regions. South Asian isotope profiles, Iranian plateau signatures, steppe community indicators are buried in the same cemetery, sometimes adjacent to one another. This is not the biological pattern of a regional population going about its local business. It is the biological pattern of a cosmopolitan trading community, assembled from across the network's range by the opportunities that the hub offered. Gonur Tepe is the subterranean silk network's most completely documented hub. It is the city that shows most clearly what the network looked like from the inside. A world city of the Bronze Age, unknown to conventional history, built entirely from the wealth of invisible commerce and inhabited by people who came from everywhere. When Sarianidi first walked across its surface, in the flat, featureless desert of southern Turkmenistan, he was walking across the roof of something that the world had forgotten existed. It took him 4 decades to understand what was beneath his feet. It may take the rest of scholarship another generation to fully accept what he found. The most powerful testimony to the subterranean silk network's existence may be the kind that its participants never intended to leave. The people who walked those routes, maintained those relay chains, and built those commercial relationships across generations could not have imagined that the cellular material in their bones would one day be recoverable, sequenceable, and interpretable by machines that they could not have conceived. And yet that is precisely what has happened. Ancient DNA analysis, the extraction and sequencing of genetic material from archaeological human remains, has in the last decade transformed the study of prehistoric human movement in ways that rewrite the conventional understanding of the ancient world's degree of connectivity. The technology works by recovering fragments of DNA from the teeth, the inner ear bones, and the petrous bones of ancient human remains. skeletal elements that preserve genetic material better than any other tissue. The fragments are then pieced together into enough of a genomic profile to allow comparison with other ancient and modern populations. Applied at scale, across dozens or hundreds of individuals from a single site or region, the patterns of ancestry become a map of human movement, one drawn not in ink, but in the language of cells. What that map shows for Bronze Age Central Asia is startling. In the period between approximately 2500 and 1800 BCE, the period of the Oxus civilization's florescence and the active operation of the subterranean silk network, the populations of the region show genetic admixture patterns far more complex than the conventional picture of isolated or loosely connected regional cultures would predict. Individuals buried at Oxus civilization sites in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan show ancestry contributions from South Asia, the Iranian plateau, the Eurasian steppe, and the Zagros highland zone, sometimes in a single individual, sometimes distributed across a community, but consistently present across the sites as a whole. The work of geneticists, including David Reich at Harvard and Vagesh Narasimhan, whose 2019 paper in Science provided the most comprehensive genomic survey of Bronze Age, South and Central Asia yet attempted, makes this pattern explicit. The mixing is not the result of a single large-scale migration event. It accumulates gradually across generations. In the pattern characteristic of communities in sustained contact through repeated small-scale movement, rather than the kind of massive population displacement that a conquest or a climate catastrophe would produce. It looks like commerce. It looks like the long-term consequence of traders settling at the hubs of a network they helped maintain, marrying into local communities, and leaving descendants who carried the genetic signatures of their origins alongside those of their adopted homes. Most specifically, studies of populations along the Kopet Dagh corridor, the Piedmont zone between northeastern Iran and the Turkmen steppe, that was one of the subterranean silk network's primary arteries, show genetic connections between populations in northeastern Iran, Turkmenistan, and the Indus Valley at dates that predate the formal Silk Road by over a millennium. The connection was already embedded in the genetic makeup of the populations living along the route before any Chinese diplomat ever came to learn about the Western lands. The bones cannot lie. The DNA does not record the names of trade goods or the routes along which they traveled, but it records something more intimate and more durable. The fact of sustained human contact, repeated across generations, in a pattern that follows the same corridors the artifacts follow. The ancient traders left their genes in the ground along the route they walked, and the ground, with a patience that neither the traders nor the empires that tried to erase them could have anticipated, kept them safe until someone came to look. In the city of Tabriz in northwestern Iran, there is a covered bazaar that has been in continuous commercial operation since at least the 13th century. Its official age, UNESCO World Heritage status, a documented history beginning in the medieval period, already makes it extraordinary by the standards of human commercial continuity. But the designation understates what it is. The Bazaar of Tabriz is not merely a very old market. It is a physical structure that grew over centuries around a commercial function that was already old when the oldest surviving sections of the building were first raised. And in its deepest sections, where the vaulting is lowest and the passages narrowest and the archaeology least disturbed, the evidence suggests structural phases that may predate the medieval period by centuries. The bazaar is underground. Not metaphorically, in the sense that the subterranean silk was underground, but actually, physically carved into the earth beneath the city's surface, with brick vaults and earthen ceilings and the particular quality of silence that enclosed underground spaces carry. Walking through the oldest parts of the Tabriz Bazaar is, in the most literal sense available to a modern body, as close as one can come to walking through the subterranean silk itself. The commercial practices visible in the bazaar economy of the modern Middle East and Central Asia bear an uncanny resemblance to the organizational logic that the archaeology of the ancient network implies. Bazaars are organized by commodity type. The carpet section in one quarter, the spice traders in another, the metal workers in a third. This specialization mirrors the dedicated production zones documented in Bronze Age trading cities across the network's range. and it is not a coincidence. It is the organizational solution that commerce arrives at when communities have been doing it long enough to discover what works, and then keep doing that thing generation after generation, because it continues to work. The caravanserai structure, the enclosed courtyard building that provided water, shelter, and commercial space for traveling merchants, is present at intervals across the entire length of the old routes, with a consistency that covers the distance between Anatolia and China without significant interruption. The basic design of the caravanserai has not changed in any fundamental way in 4,000 years. The specific materials, the decorative vocabulary, the administrative arrangements vary by period and region. But the logic, a central open courtyard with a water source, surrounded by storage and sleeping rooms, with a defensible entry point, is identical whether the structure dates to the Bronze Age or the Mughal period. The problem it solves has not changed. The solution, developed once by people who understood what traders on a long journey needed, was retained intact across every cultural transition that followed. Perhaps most specifically, Lapis lazuli is still sold in the bazaars of Kabul, Mashhad, and Peshawar. The stone is still mined in Sar-e-Sang, the same valley in the same Afghan mountains that supplied Queen Puabi's headdress in 2600 BCE. The routes it travels from those mountains to those market cities follow the same geographic logic as the routes of the 3rd millennium BCE. The same secondary valleys, the same mountain approaches, the same distribution between highland source and lowland consumer. The oldest cargo on the oldest routes is still moving. History closed a door, and the commerce walked through the window without pausing to notice. The DNA evidence discussed in the previous chapter has an implication that extends beyond the Bronze Age. The genetic mixing that characterized the subterranean Silk Network's population did not stop when the network was renamed the Silk Road, or when the Mongols reorganized it, or when the British and Russian empires competed for control of its surviving Central Asian nodes in the 19th century. The mixing continued, layer upon layer of exchange and movement accumulating in the genomes of living populations, until the modern inhabitants of the regions the network once traversed carry in their cells a biological record of every major movement that ever passed through their ancestors' territory. The Parsi community of India is among the clearest living examples of the network's biological legacy. The Parsis are descendants of Zoroastrian refugees who fled Iran following the Muslim conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries CE, eventually settling in the coastal region of Gujarat in northwestern India, where they maintained their religious identity, their language, and a remarkable degree of genetic isolation from the broader Indian population for over 1,000 years. The genetic profile of the modern Parsi community has been extensively studied, partly because their religious prohibition on intermarriage with non-Parsis makes them an unusually stable genetic reference point. What those studies show is a genome that preserves, with unusual clarity, the genetic signatures of the ancient Iranian plateau and Oxus civilization populations, the core populations of the subterranean Silk Network's western and central zones. When geneticists compare Parsi genomes to ancient DNA recovered from Oxus civilization sites, the overlap is striking enough to suggest not merely the general Iranian plateau ancestry that their historical origins would predict, but specific genetic threads connecting them to the Bronze Age communities of the Oxus Corridor and the Kopet Dag Piedmont. The Parsis did not walk the subterranean silk, they carry it. Their genomes are documents, written in the biological language of ancestry, that describe the commercial and cultural world of the pre-Islamic Iranian plateau, with a specificity that no written source from that world provides. The Hazara people of central Afghanistan carry a different but equally eloquent genetic story. The Hazara are often discussed in terms of their partial Mongolian ancestry, a consequence of the Mongol conquest and settlement of Afghanistan in the 13th century. But the Hazara genome is more complex than that single historical event accounts for. Below the Mongolian layer, genetic analysis reveals admixture from South Asian, Iranian plateau, and Inner Asian steppe populations, in a combination that mirrors the geographic range of the ancient trade network. The Hazara occupy, geographically, the central mountain zone of Afghanistan, the territory through which the network's Hindu-Kush crossings passed, the zone where Badakhshan Lapis met the relay chains that would carry it westward. Their biology reflects the commercial history of the ground beneath their feet. The Kalash people of Chitral, in northern Pakistan, present the most evocative case of all. Long studied by anthropologists for their distinctive culture, a polytheistic religion that predates Islam and possibly predates the formal versions of the Indo-Iranian religious tradition, a language related to, but distinctly separate from neighboring tongues, the Kalash have now been studied genomically in detail. What the studies suggest is a population with an ancient genetic signature that preserves aspects of the Bronze Age Indus corridor population before the large-scale movements that characterized the second millennium BCE. The Kalash are a community so geographically isolated in their high mountain valleys that the biological memory of the ancient world they inhabited has survived in them with unusual completeness. These communities are not anomalies. They are the living residue of a commercial system so old and so persistent that it left its mark in human biology as surely as it left its mark in the ground. And in these living people, the mark has survived every empire and every erasure that the world has thrown against it. At the end of a story this long and this old, it is worth pausing to consider what has actually been described. Not a curiosity, not an obscure corner of ancient history. What has been traced across these chapters is the circulatory system of human civilization, the infrastructure that made possible the Bronze Age, that enabled the exchange of technologies, which allowed complex states to emerge, that moved the ritual substances through which ancient peoples understood their relationship to the sacred, that carried the ideas that connected isolated communities of human intelligence into something that could be called a connected world. The Silk Road that history celebrates was the public manifestation of this system. The system itself is older, quieter, and more fundamental than any named road. Every empire that encountered it tried to own it. The pattern is so consistent across millennia that it becomes almost mathematical. The Persians built a parallel road and used administrative incentives to capture the visible traffic. Alexander destroyed the indigenous operators and replaced them with Greek foundations. The Han formalized the routes, renamed them, and installed a surveillance and taxation apparatus along their length. The Mongols imposed the organizational efficiency of steppe commerce on what remained. The Ottomans taxed it at every junction they controlled. The British and Russian empires competed for control of its surviving Central Asian remnants, treating the mountain passes and oasis cities of the region as strategic assets in a geopolitical contest that had more to do with their own rivalry than with the commerce those places had been facilitating for 3,000 years. None of them eliminated it. Some captured significant portions and made themselves wealthy in the process. All of them ultimately found that the network adapted around their attempts at control, routing through channels they had not found or could not patrol, maintaining in the gaps and shadows the commercial relationships that the official system could not extinguish, because the official system could not see them. The reason for this resilience is the same reason the network was invisible to begin with. It was built on relationships rather than institutions. Institutions can be destroyed or captured. A palace can be burned, an administrative archive can be seized, a road can be blocked or taxed into irrelevance. But a relationship between two communities that have traded with each other for 3 generations, that understand each other's quality standards and trust each other's weight measures and know each other's seasonal patterns, that is not something any army has ever successfully eliminated. It is distributed, redundant, and held in human memory in ways that make it immune to the strategies that empires use against formal systems. This quality, the quality of being too distributed, too informal, and too deeply embedded in human relationships to be captured by any central authority, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a description of the most resilient kind of system that human beings build. It is the description of every informal economy that has ever survived in the margins of a formal one. Every underground network that has persisted beneath the surveillance of the state, every commercial relationship that has maintained itself through centuries of political disruption by being too quiet to attract the attention that would destroy it. The most powerful commercial systems in human history have not been the ones that empires built. They have been the ones that empires could not find. The ones that moved through the cracks of official geography, that operated in the language of relationships rather than the language of records, that survived not because anyone protected them, but because they were built from something that does not require protection. the mutual need of human beings for what only other human beings, far away, can provide. The road that history forgot is still here. It is in the bazaars and the mountain passes, and the living genes of the people who walk above its corridors. It was never buried. It was only waiting, with the patience of something very old, for someone to look in the right direction.